Now we continue with a program that we thought that it could be nice to have the person from the IAWA, IAWA, and to introduce her work, we invited Marina Zellner, that she is architect, teacher, professor at school. She's also the Dean of the Department of Graphic Expression and is the first female president of the Chamber of Architects in Valencia. And she's a friend. And she's saying apologies because she doesn't like to talk in English, so she's going to talk in English, in Spanish, and I will translate as much as possible, not everything. Okay? Thank you.
Gracias, Eva. Buenas tardes. En primer lugar, repito lo que ha explicado. Mi inglés es bastante flojo y prefiero hablar en castellano.
She's apologizing, so no problem.
Bueno, también decir que para mí es un honor venir a presentar la conferencia inaugural de este congreso, precisamente por lo que significa el Congreso, por lo que significa el poner de manifiesto el trabajo de las mujeres arquitectas, que mejor después del vídeo de Susana Torre, que explica que todo es importante, todo nuestro trabajo es importante y es importante que la gente sepa que hacemos ese trabajo.
Bueno. I'm not a professional, so I will make a vision. She's saying that she's happy to be here today because she thinks it's an important moment, and she thinks that it's important in this opening lecture to talk about the work of women architects because it's important. We have to make people to see that it's important too. So she's happy to be here because of the importance of the moment. It's a short resume, sorry.
También hay que recalcar la importancia del archivo. Yo siempre he defendido que para mirar al futuro tenemos que mirar y revisar el pasado. Y la mejor manera de hacerlo es tener un archivo, una información que ponga en valor todo el trabajo que se ha hecho para llegar donde estamos.
She's also saying that she also thinks that it's important an archive because to go to the future, to go ahead, it's important to know the past, what had happened before, and she thinks that it's important for women working today knowing what had happened before. An archive is a good tool to get that input.
En el Colegio de Arquitectos, desde que estoy yo como presidenta, se está trabajando en la importancia de recuperar legados de trabajos de arquitectos de la provincia de Valencia, que evidentemente, como podéis imaginar, hasta ahora todo lo que tenemos son legados de arquitectos, no de arquitectas. Esperamos que en breve ya podamos recuperar algún legado de mujeres arquitectas, porque lógicamente en Valencia el número de mujeres colegiadas es menor, ha tardado más en el tiempo en que la figura femenina esté presente en los colectivos profesionales, y como ejemplo es que yo soy, y ya tengo una edad, la primera mujer presidenta del Colegio de Arquitectos.
Okay. She's saying that she is president of the Chamber of Architects of Valencia. She has been involved in getting all the production, she said legado, but I don't know how to translate that in English, the production of the architects working in the province and get it into the chamber as an archive there. But at the moment, they only got men architects there. And she thinks, or she comments, that women have had more problems in reaching the profession through time. And at the moment, and as an example, she says that she is the first woman president of the Chamber of Architects here in Valencia.
Bien, y yo creo que para seguir hablando, ¿quién mejor que Paola Zellner para explicarnos precisamente la importancia de ese archivo? Si quieres, paso ya a su biografía.
Con lo que tú quieras. She's saying that to talk about the importance of archives, who better than Paola Zellner talking about the IAWA?
Paola Zellner, me imagino que casi todas las personas presentes ya conocen un poco su trayectoria. Se licenció en la Universidad de Buenos Aires y ejerció arquitectura en Argentina y Uruguay. Ha trabajado en Los Ángeles con Norman Miller Architects y con Jim Bassett fundó el estudio de diseño Zellner & Bassett. En la actualidad es profesora asociada en Virginia Tech y directora de iniciativas del International Chief of Women in Architecture Center. Su trabajo creativo, basado en el material conservado en las colecciones de IAWA, incluye la instalación inmersiva 30×30, mostrada internacionalmente y por la que recibió un premio importante, seguro que lo digo mal, entonces...
¿Tú crees que yo me voy a acordar de todo esto?
No, te lo paso.
Vale.
Su investigación ha sido publicada en Museum Making, Narratives, Architectures Exhibitions, en AXA Proceedings, en la revista Bitácora Arquitectura y en The Roses Companion to Women in Architecture. Su publicación más reciente, en coautoría con Marcia Feuerstein y Jody Lacou, es el libro Expanding Field of Architecture, Women in Practice Across the World, que muestra 40 proyectos de arquitectura de todo el mundo realizados por mujeres en una diversidad de prácticas. Habla Eva y adelante.
Okay, we think, and she thinks that there is no need to introduce Paola because all of us know her, but to say some words, she graduated from the Universidad of Buenos Aires. She worked as an architect in Argentina and Uruguay. She got her master's degree in SciArc. She worked in Los Angeles con Norman R. Miller Architects, and together with Jim Bassett, she founded the design studio Zellner & Bassett. At the present moment, she's associate professor in Virginia Tech, and she is the director of the initiative of the International Archive of Women in Architecture. Her creative work, based or founded in the material that is kept in the collections of IAWA, includes this immersive installation 30×30, shown internationally, and that received the award 2018-2019 by ACSA Creative Achievement Award. Her investigation has been published in Museum Making, Narratives, Architectures Exhibitions by Routledge and AXA Proceedings, and in the journal Bitácora Arquitectura en Reality, because it is in Spanish, and the Routledge Companion to Women in Architecture, together with many other colleagues that are here today. Her latest publication, co-authored with Marcia Feuerstein and Judy Lacou, is the book Expanding Field of Architecture, Women in Practice Across the Globe, that shows 40 projects of architecture all over the world built by or produced by women in a great diversity of practices. I think that I passed the exam more or less. Okay.
Bueno, pues
okay.
Muchas gracias y cuando quieras puedes empezar.
Okay, thank you.
Bueno, good evening. I'm more than very excited to be here. This is just such a wonderful event and opportunity to meet so many people that I've seen and met virtually through Zoom and other kinds of events, other kinds of conferences around the world. I'm very thankful, of course, to Carlos and Eva and the whole organization committee, as well as the Higher Technical School of Architecture and the Polytechnic University of Valencia for supporting this event. It's really a messianic effort, and I really appreciate it. Appreciate the staff as well, and I also want to say how much I appreciate the effort of the students participating on the workshop that we've been having the last 2 days. It has been a blast. It has been a big group, and everybody very excited and committed, and helping put together the exhibit that you will see tomorrow. We think it will be up tomorrow. So it's a wonderful exhibit, and they have all worked very hard on it. And it has been a really marvelous experience. So I hope you're ready. This is a 2-hour, 30-minute long presentation about the archive. Now it's just going to be like about 45 minutes. I'm going to go through many aspects of it, a little bit the need for it, the origins, some of its contents, and some of its initiatives. I also want to put out a disclaimer. I did the presentation on Keynote. We have exported it to PowerPoint. It may look a little funny, like international, how it's going off. It's not designed. That's the migration from one software to another, but I don't think it's going to be too bad. So this presentation, I entitled it Activism in the Periphery. The built environment is a record of the values, preconceptions, needs, and hopes upheld through the different periods by the cultures that have produced it. The built environment is an archive in itself. History has distilled seemingly objective accounts of the development of the built environment, and architectural publications have cemented that reality. What is to be included in history, which works of architecture are selected for publication, and how they are to be credited also underscore the omissions and the biases perpetuated through time in detriment of the shared common good. The written and accepted version of history is lacking immensely. The International Archive of Women in Architecture, the IAWA, was founded almost 40 years ago in 1985, following the vision of Bulgarian-American architect Dr. Milka T. Blishnikov, 1927-2010. Since its inception, the archive's mission has been to rectify the exclusion of women from the written history of architecture, exclusion that had resulted from centuries of habitual omission or intentional erasure in support of the patriarchal ideal of the master creator. Blishnikov understood that not until women were recognized for their contributions could a more balanced history of architecture emerge. The archive was therefore a critical foundation of this enterprise, for in the absence of proper historical credit confirming women's involvement in architecture around the world, only their professional and personal papers could evidence and verify their contributions and substantiate their inclusion in history. Drawings are powerful artifacts, for in the process of developing, representing, and conveying an idea or a design, they also capture aspects of the maker, the discipline, and the context of the time. Australian architect and educator Neville Quarry foregrounds this capacity of drawings, affirming that they, quote, reveal the state of mind of the drawer and the state of graphic and spatial perception of the contemporaneous culture. While Dr. Julie Collins, collections manager at the University of South Wales, emphasizes drawings' potential to, quote, reflect the social, economic, personal, and cultural factors at work during a building's creation. It becomes clear then that in addition to acting as biographical proof and beyond their specific content, the preserved artifacts and drawings hold a wealth of intangible information, quote, practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, and know-how, end quote, intangible information that demands to be incorporated into architecture's canons. This presentation studies selected archived artifacts and reflects on current initiatives of the IAWA Center that aim to capture and disseminate both tangible and intangible knowledge of women's practices. So I'm going to go rather briefly over the origins of the archive and the founder of the archive. Milka Blishnikov was born in Varna, Bulgaria, and earned a master's degree in architecture from the State Polytechnic University of Sofia, Bulgaria in 1951, and practiced architecture for almost a decade before escaping the communist regime by fleeing to France. 2 years later, in 1961, Blizhnakov arrived in the United States and immediately found work in architecture. While in practice, she became also a full-time student, furthering her studies on Soviet architecture and receiving her PhD in architectural history from Columbia University in 1971. Her academic career began the following year at the University of Texas, Austin, and in 1974, she arrived at Virginia Tech, where she became a member of the faculty of the College of Architecture and Urban Studies for over 2 decades until her retirement in 1998. Growing up in Bulgaria, Blizhnakov was raised among professional women. Her mother was a doctor, her aunt was a dentist, and her godmother was an eye surgeon. Years later, as an avid researcher of Soviet architecture and the avant-garde, Blizhnakov was clearly aware that women in Eastern Europe and Russia had enrolled in architecture courses as early as 1904, and that, quote, during times of war, revolution, and uprising, end quote, women had played the vital role of builders, rebuilding, for example, quote, the towns of Germany and Russia almost single-handedly after the Second World War. Moreover, Blizhnakov celebrates the force of these European women who, quote, flocked to the universities after the war. For beyond responding to the opportunities opened to them by the historical context, they proactively shifted the discipline. In her view, these women, quote, began to change the architectural profession from a gentleman's aesthetic preoccupation of stylistic concerns to a social commitment for public welfare, end quote. It was therefore only from the perspective of the educator in the United States in the late 1970s that the absence of women precedents in the history of the discipline became strikingly apparent to Blizhnakov. While women had been enrolling in architecture programs, there was, quote, little if any information about their past to claim and relate to, not enough known history to define their professional roots and developments, and very few professional models to follow, end quote. Blizhnakov promptly resolved to counteract these exclusions by establishing an archive. She declared that, quote, the omission of women's contributions neglected for so long needed immediate rectification, and identified one of the factors that had played an important role in the omission: women's reticence to donate their papers, believing them to possess no value. Blizhnakov asserted that, above all, since most women were and still are reluctant to promote and publish their accomplishments, their archives must be saved and become available for future generations to evaluate. But perhaps more striking than women's reluctance to promote their work is the realization that the media coverage has given, until relatively recent times, little to no credit to the work of women. This fact ultimately shaped the mission of the IWA as envisioned by Blizhnakov, who recognized that since women's work was seldom mentioned by the press, the archive of the designer herself becomes the only source of information, further emphasizing the importance and urgency of preserving the original papers of women's work. Blizhnakov arrived at Virginia Tech in 1974, and by 1985, joined in her effort by the university libraries, the archive was finally established. Blizhnakov began contacting women architects throughout the United States and Europe, as well as national and international professional organizations, by sending over 1,000 personal letters while also traveling to several countries for events and network building. This is Milka's cabinet, where she kept record of names and status of the correspondence of her multiple exchanges. It is a real treasure, and it was almost lost, filled with fragments, voids, silence, and promise. We have recently created a spreadsheet of its contents, and Patricia Santos has requested information on Portuguese women that were mentioned, listed in the cards in the cabinet. It is still awaiting to be explored. In the template letter preserved in the archive dated July 9th, 1985, Blishnikov underlined, the scope of the archives will be international and will include work from the beginning of women's involvement in architecture in any capacity up to the present time. Until recent history, women had not always been permitted to attend college, apprentice, obtain the professional license, or practice. Many had, nevertheless, contributed to the built environment for centuries in different capacities and were owed due credit for their contribution. It is for this reason that the archive was named the International Archive of Women in Architecture rather than International Archive of Women Architects. The goals of the mission and the goals of the archive. So the archive focuses on the pursuit and preservation of professional and personal papers of pioneer women across the globe via multiple initiatives and fosters its dissemination through research, exhibitions, and publications. Today, with about 500 collections representing now 48 countries and 17 languages, the IAWA remains the only archive of its kind in the world. Referencing the IAWA in her research, Dr. Julie Collins suggests that, quote, while this is one way of ensuring women's records are kept, ideally, the goal should be to ensure equal representation in all archives. We could not agree more. However, until that comes to be, the IAWA remains an essential repository. Now, there's a question of what should be preserved, and Susana Torre brought that up already. The short piece on exactitude in science by Argentine writer and poet Jorge Luis Borges narrates the unfortunate fate of the map of the empire, that cartographers striving for perfection struck at the same size of the empire. Rendered useless, the map was eventually abandoned and neglected, becoming a ruin, a relic of the disciplines of geography. The story raises questions about what should be archived and whether it is possible or even necessary to preserve it all. Surveying the historical landscape in the 80s, Blishnikov advocated for preserving everything. She did so because beyond the fundamental need for the material, she understood the magnitude of the omission. As others did before her, Susana Torre's 1977 exhibition and book, Women in American Architecture, A Historic and Contemporary Perspective, culminated a 4-year or 2-year project with the Architectural League of New York. Together, they founded in 1973 the Archive of Women in Architecture and launched a national survey to collect both biographical and project data from women working in the profession, as well as those already retired. The Archive of Women in Architecture ceased to collect material after the exhibit and publication. The IAWA holds the records of this impressive endeavor in the collection MS 2005-016, which consists mainly of correspondence, project worksheets, resumes, journal articles and publications, architectural projects and drawings, photographs of projects, and research material collected by the archive. So what should be preserved? In her book, Privacy and Publicity, Beatriz Colomina contrasts the attitudes of Adolphe Loos and Le Corbusier toward the preservation of their own work. Quote, Loos vacates the space and destroys all traces behind him, end quote, preserving nothing. Quote, Le Corbusier fills a space ahead of him, preserving everything. As a result, quote, the research into Loos is organized by the gaps in the archive, whilst the research into Le Corbusier's is organized by archival excesses. However, both have been profusely written about. The authors of Loos' monograph had to rely on small fragments, contextual information, and what could be considered peripheral material, in the form of, quote, conversations with Loos' friends, clients, and colleagues, end quote, which they deemed as rather subjective and deformed by interpretation. But isn't history, with its conventions and methods and limited by the challenges inherent in archiving, already subjective? Can it ever be free from interpretation? In most cases, women donate only portions of their material, if at all, that which has survived life, family, moves, emigration, retirement, and self-judgment. As in the case of Lilia Scala, who escaped Nazi Germany in 1939 carrying only her student portfolio, which was donated to the archive by her niece in 2003. Once the donated material is received, the archivist, much like a cartographer, must make choices to preserve a comprehensive overview of the woman's practice while editing in response to archival space constraints. Resulting archives are thus, by nature and by necessity, incomplete, but remain in all their forms the basis for the written history. Colomina suggests that Laws had no archive. He was, nevertheless, written into history, confirming that a wealth of information resides elsewhere, making a case for the periphery as a reliable and rich source. In Book of Ages, The Life and Opinions of Jane Franklin, historian Gilles Lepore portrays the life of Jane Franklin, younger sister of one of the founding fathers of the United States, Benjamin Franklin, and bases the reconstruction of her life in great part on their decades-long relationship recorded through correspondence. Jane cherished and preserved every letter that she received from her brother and diligently bequeathed the documents to ensure they would be preserved after her passing. Benjamin kept only but a few of hers. Yet it was in Benjamin's letters, replying to Jane's inquiries and stories, that a portrait of Jane begins to emerge, where the story of her life and of the time is found. Her story demonstrates the potential of the periphery, and in the absence of records, urges the uncovering of history residing there. Whilst periphery may be commonly defined as an area lying beyond the strict limits of a thing, a fringe, margin, with exclusionary connotations, the origin of the word, from peri, around, ferein, to bear, also suggests actions, to carry around, to bring forth, to deliver, to mother, to produce. These variants suggest that there is an abundance of knowledge in the periphery waiting and needing to be confirmed as such, both in substance and kind. Stories like Jane Franklin's advocate for the uncovering of history residing in the fringes, but also, and perhaps more importantly, demand the expansion of the canons in order to include material that may have been deemed as subjective, but which nevertheless holds truth and sheds light on history, especially in the absence of what is considered to be conventional archival material. Lepore cites American novelist and historian Charles Brockton Brown, who in 1806 published an essay called Historical Characters Are False Representations of Nature, where he questions the emphasis that written history has placed on greatness and the impact that this has had, the unfairness of this tendency toward the vast number of those that have been obscured by the idealization of a selected few. Lepore asks, what would it mean to write the history of an age not only from what has been saved, but also from what has been lost? What would it mean to write a history concerned not only with the lives of the famous, but also with the lives of the obscure? Within the challenges previously discussed, the IWA's mission is to bring into the light and give voice to the many women that have participated in any capacity and impacted architecture in diverse ways. International in scope, the archive seeks to discover and preserve work that represents all regions and all forms of practice that women have carried out. But the IWA's mission goes beyond elevating women, and it is not its goal to stage a confrontation between men and women, but rather to defy the ideal with the real, to balance history. Reality includes the periphery. The accounting of reality, therefore, should include it too. IWA looks into the periphery beyond individual exceptionalism. History has traditionally revolved around the illusion of exceptionalism privileged by the patriarchal value system, one based on the ideal hero. The archive strives instead to reveal the exceptionalism that lies in the aggregation of actions and contributions made by the global community of individual women toward a larger cause. There are myriad examples in the IAWA collections of women that, while unrecognized, have expanded the boundary of what was admissible and allowed, or what was expected of the profession and of women. Every item in the collection is in this regard consequential. And here I'm going to show now some examples with some brief stories around them. The collection of Melita Rodek. Born in Milan, Italy, to Austrian parents, Rodek studied architecture from 1932 to 1937 at the Technical University of Vienna. 2 years after graduating, Rodek emigrated to the United States, where she had a prolific professional career producing over 120 projects, including churches, community projects, commercial, residential, and government commissions, as well as urban planning. In her collection, a handwritten letter to Plishnikov dated April 4th, 1992 reads, "Dear Milka, thanks for your kind letter and invitation of April 14th. I enjoyed reading the list of your collection and recognized two, Liane Zimbler, for whom I worked 1 or 2 summers while a student, and Helene Kohler Bookweiser, who studied with me. She was not married yet. There was a third girl among over 100 men, Helene Alexander, but I don't know anything about her." This particular fragment serves as a vivid example of the promise of truth to be found not only within this individual collection, Rodek's collection, but also within the coincidental lateral associations to other collections existing in the IAWA if we were to compare and contrast those of Rodek, Zimbler, and Kohler Bookweiser together. Yet it could be argued that the most important piece offered by Rodek in this letter is Alexander's name. Invisible until named, this clue opens the door to the potential uncovering of Alexander's practice and life. The IAWA does not have Alexander's materials, so I went ahead and did a little search to see if she had become visible since the time of this letter, 1992, and I did find some information about her. Her name is Aline Holst Alexander, born in Vienna, 1914. Oh, the letters are terrible. And passed away in Utrecht in 1965. She was an Austrian architect who contributed to the reconstruction of Utrecht, Netherlands after the war. She fled Austria intending to go to Australia, but met Lambert Holst from Utrecht, whom she married. She worked as an independent architect after the war, designing mainly retail properties. In 1957, she designed an apartment building on the Oudenoord in Utrecht for single women, very particular in type, although I had a conversation this morning with Carolina Quiroga. No? Yeah, that was very enlightening. So this is wonderful. This building was also the first one in Utrecht to have the ground floor devoted to retail. It was also the tallest apartment building in the city at the time. So it could be said that Alexander was, perhaps unknowingly, a pioneer. She died in Utrecht at the age of 51. In another collection, that of architect Hans Schroeder, who was contemporary of Alexander, her sketch of the living space in her childhood home, dated 1937, turns the spotlight toward her mother, Truus Schroeder. Although not an architect, Truus Schroeder designed in partnership with architect Gerrit Rietveld the Schroeder House, 1924 in Utrecht, among other projects. With conviction during the design process, Truus Schroeder, quote, emphasized her need for a home in which parents and children would be brought together in an open space where conversations would be wide-ranging, end quote, rejecting the traditional model of discrete rooms defined by fixed walls in favor of sliding panels. The resulting open living space, with a unique flexibility, offered its users a new environment in which to redefine family life, women's rights, and the responsibilities of individuals, end quote. Living in this experimental environment from a very young age and immersed in the ongoing design discussions between Truus and Rietveld undoubtedly made a strong impression on Hans Schroeder and facilitated her path into architecture in some ways. Han worked in Rietveld's office for 5 years, as stated in his letter of recommendation, before practicing by herself, joining the Red Cross, and emigrating to the United States. Reciprocally, the work that Han developed throughout her prolific career shows a heightened awareness for interiors affordances, lightly tracing out her mother, who from the periphery and with vision, quote, helped to shape and define the course of modern architecture. In another large collection in the IWA archive, that of German architect Hilde Westrom, an extensive curriculum vitae records her pioneering career with over 800 condominiums and housing units designed and produced independently during the post-war rebuild of Berlin. Project number 125 in the CV lists her design for the Interbau model flat, part of the special exhibit, The City of Tomorrow, held in Berlin in 1957 at the International Architectural Exhibition Interbau 57. Sharing similarities with Truus Schroeder's ideas, Westrom's design offered a new form of living that was flexible and granted, with its sliding walls, spatial variability in response to preferences for privacy and leisure. Westrom was invited to give a lecture on the technology of quiet living at the Forum for Beautiful Living during Interbau 57, beside, quote, this is extracted from her CV, beside Alto, Alter, Bartning, Rosso, Mia Seeger, von Weich, Westrom, Weizmann, as listed under project number 126. It is worth noting an additional layer of nuanced information embedded in the factual CV. Of the panelists listed, Seeger, not captured in the event's photograph, is the only architect to include her first name, thus disallowing the typical assumption of the architect being male. Many years later, in 1971, Westrom worked with renowned architect Professor Hans Scharoun on the project for Berlin's Staatsbibliothek. Initial searches have returned no published information about the project that mentions her or clarifies what her contribution to the project might have been. The only evidence of this collaboration is the entry on her CV under project number 166. A fact that not only highlights the significance of preserving CVs and archive collections, but also exposes, should it be omitted, the precarious nature of information. Elsewhere in the archive, one finds Latvian-born architect Vera Jensson, who studied with Auguste Perret at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, 1945 to 1949. Upon completing her studies, she worked full-time in the Atelier Le Corbusier on the reconstruction of Paris until she obtained her French professional license. She was later awarded a full scholarship to attend the Illinois Institute of Technology, IIT, where she studied under Mies van der Rohe, and from where she received her master's degree in 1952. Jensson eventually immigrated to the US, first to New York, and finally settled in California, where job opportunities for women were more available. Despite her contributions and her academic professional lineage, Jensson has remained marginalized. Her collection consists of 89 drawings documenting her career as a student at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris during the early stages of her education, and as a professional architect in California, where she practiced last. The existing material frames the glaring gap in her body of work between those stages and raises questions as to the possible reasons for its absence. The void could be perceived as a lack of evidence due to the patriarchal obscuring of records, but it should also be regarded as a productive gap, as demonstrated in the histories of Laws and James Franklin, a necessary absence that propels investigation forward. So finding and preserving. The IAWA's mission is simple, yet finding and gathering the work of invisible women to be preserved is ever more challenging. The collections focus mainly on women born in the 19th and 20th centuries, whose work is mostly pre-digital, handmade, and as one-of-a-kind artifacts risk being easily lost to history without a trace. Around the world, there are flat files in offices, tubes and boxes in attics, inside closets, in storage units and under beds, holding professional papers of women whose names are known only to their families and personal circles, which quietly await to be uncovered and included. given enough time to reflect, every person here and everywhere, will remember a woman in their family, neighborhood, or context that has practiced or contributed in some form to the built environment. Therefore, every individual can act as a bridge and is encouraged, please, to do so. Whether in the IAWA or in any other invested institution, it is imperative to preserve the work. So I'm going to look now briefly at the initiatives that we've been promoting. A deep learning and emotional experience occurs when holding a unique original artifact with traces of its author. Unfortunately, this irreplaceable experience is only available to archive visitors, and while profoundly impactful, leaves too small an outreach footprint when compared to the scale of the archive's mission. The IWA Center multiple initiatives strive to make the archive known as a beacon and safe repository of original material, while incentivizing researchers to draw out the history held in it. Some initiatives promote the writing of history, like the annual Mika Blishnikov Research Prize for research conducted in the ILWA collections, or the IWA Christine Fallon Prize for publication-ready manuscripts highlighting women practicing in large corporations in the 20th century, another way of becoming invisible. While other initiatives focus on collection, like oral histories and one-by-one collection, and or dissemination, like the IAWA Instagram feed. IAWA International Symposia, as well as exhibits and presentations, among many other initiatives. With broadcasting intent, the Instagram feed, IAWA_VT, digitally publishes the treasures of the IAWA to educate the public, to attract researchers, but also to reach women in architecture or their relatives who may consider bequeathing their materials. Beyond displaying artifacts, the posts share personal bios and close-ups of selected material, revealing intangible knowledge within individual practices and their particular circumstances. As a totality, the growing Instagram visual archive exposes a range of practices, know-hows, roles, and obstacles women across the world have navigated through, contributing to architecture's heritage. The challenge remains reaching the generations that do not have a digital presence. The hope is that as a social network following IAWA_VT continues to expand, the probability of reaching the pioneers may increase. So please do follow IAWA_VT and please participate. Among collecting initiatives, the Oral History Project seeks to gather and record qualitative and nuanced forms of knowledge from conversations with the women in architecture or with their friends, clients, and colleagues, end quote, not unlike Law's historians did. The project proposes inviting the women to the archive and, while revisiting their personal collection, record the memories triggered by their projects and the context in which they were created. Valuable information that cannot be gleaned from the artifacts alone. Despite the technical and logistical exigencies of this project, its worth lies on the wealth of intangible information communicated through the spontaneous facial expressions and the tone and cadence of the human voice that can only be captured in the immediacy of a recorded and scripted conversation. Can I play this?
And we just took it for granted. So when I did the Leroy lettering thing,
Yes.
I did a little history and I put in about how papers and gone from linen to paper and to mylar and all the different materials we worked on, and when you worked in pencil and ink and things like this. And I put the little history in the box with the Leroy. And this, I had two of them sets, but this was a nicer set. And how lettering got on the drawings. It used to be always freehand, and then we had stencils, and then we had rub-ons, and we had this. But they Leroyed the big buildings. And so on a large building, you have a couple pages of index, okay? Right. And that Leroying is, you have to have a loose wrist because it's killing if you do it all day. Not fun to do. And some people could never do it,
Right. So that was Jane Hastings talking about the time when she was in practice and she needed to use the Leroy, which was a lettering tool, and how hard it was to do all the lettering and explaining. So her collection includes that tool among many other tools, and she provided a little description of how to use it, but how much she dreaded when she was assigned to write all the specific specs of a project. There was a lot of text involved. So we're arriving finally to the One by One initiative. This is an ongoing initiative, is critical in the collecting quest of the IWA Center, and concentrates on the initial step of identifying women, as in Rodek's example with Alexander, or has women self-identify, which is really important. Launched in 2019, One by One aims to collect just one flat original item, not a copy, authored by every woman in design and architecture around the world, past and present, an item that captures a breakthrough in her education or practice. The submittal is accompanied by the CV of the author and a handwritten narrative explaining the relevance of the donated piece. The CV is essential, as seen in Vestrom's case, for it defines the scope of her practice, influences, impact, and associations. The brief, handwritten narrative, on the other hand, is an invaluable treasure that captures the inner voice of the individual. It provides a window into the individual, her work, and her personal career, while bringing specificity to the work with a subtlety and nuance that is unlikely to be gleaned from the material alone. Not unlike the Oral Histories project, the handwritten text reunites the work with its maker, providing a more complete understanding of both. Yet in crafting the handwritten text, the information distilled is of a different nature than that of the interview's spontaneous flow. It is with this brief submittal that an individual collection can be established in the IAWA for every woman whose work is collected, and with it ensure her place in history is recorded. The critical obstacle for One by One and for the IAWA is reaching women that have no digital presence, a hindrance that can only be surmounted with the help of an activist broader network. Following are two recent examples of network activism of great impact. The first one is One by One Colombia 2022, organized jointly between the Network of Arquitectas Colombianas, led by IAWA advisor Ana María Pinzón Romero, supported by the Society of Colombian Architects and the IAWA. Launched in July 2022 with a deadline of March 8, 2023, the initiative collected 70 items representing 14 regions of Colombia. This initiative had great impact, for it was the first at this scale, and there was, prior to it, no Colombian representation in the archive. Ana María Pinzón traveled with the material to Virginia Tech, where we set up the exhibit One by One Colombia as one of the main events of the 2023 IAWA Symposium. And here I'm going to show some of the images of that, the moment of opening the exhibit. Oops. Showing also the importance of coming close and have an intimate relationship with the piece and the handwritten text accompanying it, coming close to the author. The second example of network activism was Una por Una, El Momento es Ahora, organized in Buenos Aires by the network Soy Arquitecta, with the support of the Consejo Profesional de Arquitectura y Urbanismo. Prior to this initiative, the IAWA had only 4 existing collections of Argentine architects, a very large collection of Susana Torres materials, almost 27 cubic feet, who was one of the original advisors when the IAWA was formed, a collection of Marta Vilmanevich, as well as Spanish-born landscape architect Diana Balmoris, educated in Tucumán, Argentina, who later practiced in the USA, and a very small collection for Olga Krasuk. Una por Una, El Momento es Ahora, collected 105 pieces representing 12 regions of the country. With a shorter window, the call was launched in December 2022 with a deadline of March 8, 2023. The call was followed by a month-long public exhibit hosted by the Consejo Profesional, CEPAO. It was a unique exhibition, the first one of its kind in the city, and most likely in the country, showing the work of over 100 Argentine women. And here are some of the images of how it was a very large exhibit and how it was set throughout the building of the Consejo Profesional. And this is Soy Arquitecta, the activist network, of which there are several powerful and impactful ones around the world. We must continue to join forces. The material gathered by these initiatives will continue to be exhibited prior to entering the IAWA collections for preservation and research. They will be cataloged per country event while simultaneously entered into the overall one-by-one collection. Resonating with Jane Franklin's Book of Ages, the book that she created to keep record of the growing family tree, the one-by-one collection will record and materialize this developing weave built by individual women one by one, highlighting the emergent map of the unrealized history of
Can you, ¿puedes repetir, por favor?
Sí. Spec, S-P-E-C, S-P-E-C, dot, lib, L-I-B, punto, V-T, punto, E-D-U, la barra así, y agua. ¿En español? Ah, no. Ah. Sí. Eva has all the links.
Yes, I was going to say that it's easy to get the link, don't worry. We will
Yes.
take tomorrow. Any more questions here?
Thank you so much. I had the chance to visit your archives 1 year ago. I'm from Brussels, and I was so happy to see Dita Roch-Gourary in your slides because she's one of the first Belgian women architects. I was also wondering after the presentation of Susanna Torre about these tickets and the cheese history. I don't know if you remember, but in the Dita Roch-Gourary funds, there were a lot of private information, like her personal diaries when she was 7 years old, hold a lot of information about her really, like her young age. And I would like to know what's your politics about those kind of private, intimate documents. Why do you keep them? And why is it maybe important? I would love to hear you about that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. I am of the, I think similarly to Milka that everything should be archived because in a way we do not want to limit what research may come out of. We cannot guess what questions or curiosities researchers will have. And so when we make decisions of what we will keep and what we will not keep, we are excluding portions of potential research and history. What we have in the archive depends also on what the people donate, what they send, what they think is important. So there's usually, not in all cases, but in many cases, there's a curation that occurs by the author or by their relatives before sending the material in. Some people just put it in a bag and send it, and then we have to deal with it, and organize it. Some people organize it very well and curate it and send only a few things depending on how they want to present themselves. So I am not sure exactly why those diaries are there. If she sent them or her relatives sent them, I don't know who sent the material for her archive. If she had already, she sent it? So she chose to have those shown. And when I was working on this digital exhibit for the 30th anniversary of the archive in 2015, I actually looked at some of her diaries and I thought they were very impactful, not because I was getting some good gossip out of them, but because I realized how much we go through similar experiences. So where she's writing in several languages because she wants to stay fluent in all of them. But she also talks about her feelings as she's in architecture school and her fears and how she fears her professor and how she wants to work but she procrastinates and how she feels bad about and it resonates so much. And so I think it's interesting to read that from decades ago and thinking, okay, here I am, decades later, I'm doing the same thing. I procrastinate, I fear, but it gives you some, I don't know how to explain it. It's very impactful to be able to find that information all of a sudden. And I think that is one of the beauties of the archive. As you go through the material, you resonate with the different women whose work you're looking at, when you find little scribbles on the side, little things that they're trying, when they change their mind, when they're hating something, when they're loving something, when they're scratching the paper, because that is awful, or when, ooh, I had an idea, or like, I don't know if you saw in that little cropping of Hans Schroeder's notes where she's doing all these calculations about ceiling plan, which is really dry, and then she puts at the bottom something to dream about. I'm like, what was that? You know, so we never know. So I really think that we should keep everything that arrives. But there are physical limitations as well. And I remember you. I bumped into you, didn't I, in the study room in the archive? Yes, I remember, because we talked about detail. I remember that, yes. Thanks for visiting.
More questions? Are you?
Hi, it was fascinating. Thank you so much. I have two questions, actually, if you don't mind. One of them is, with all the information that you hold in Virginia Tech in the IAWA, has anyone ever tried to do an exercise in kind of mapping the different international conditions for women? Because I come from Ireland, and I know that we have, you know, our feminism, our movement, and the rise of women architecture is very much linked to political, cultural, social conditions in the country. And I think it'd be really interesting. It's very, you know, there's that cohort of women that came from Eastern Europe and Central Europe at a particular time, and a lot of them emigrated, as did their male counterparts, to the United States over time. And I just think that's fascinating. I'm just wondering, has anyone taken that on? Because I think it could tell a whole history of the world by doing that. And then the other one is, I'm just wondering about how to disseminate this to a wider audience, because my experience of being an architect and working in the profession is that we as architects are fantastic about talking to each other about what we do, but we're not so good about getting it out to a wider audience. And I just think this is fascinating. You know, women in STEM is a big thing. These women are the pioneers of that movement, and I think it would be very encouraging for other women in other fields to see what women architects are doing. And I'm just wondering, is that something that you and your organization embark onto?
Remind me, what was the topic of the first question? And
Just like about kind of mapping the international conditions.
Oh, yes. I don't know of any mapping project. So we are mostly, there's a repository, and we are like the bullhorn trying to say, hey, we are preserving work, and so trying to get people to know that we exist and trying to preserve the work and promoting all these initiatives that are about broadcasting and disseminating. So we do not, as a center, produce much of the research, and I know that there are many researchers contacting the archive and doing work, but I am not aware of all the research that goes on. It would be a fascinating project. When I worked on that big immersive exhibit, one of the components was the mapping, which I thought would be like, oh, well, really easy. We're showing 30 women, we show the mapping of her. And then when you start actually looking at the mapping, you realize it gets complex really fast. Because you have women that were born, studied, practiced, died in the same place, but you have many that were born here, studied there, traveled over there, emigrated, escaped, worked in this country on projects in the other country, and you're like, okay, that's a project in itself. So we reduced the scope of that very much to be able to put it in that exhibit, to show it at the time that we needed to show it, but we understand that it's a really important project that will take time and will take, maybe you can come over and we can start working on that project. It will be really fascinating. But it's also important to understand how complex it is, right? But it would be really great. I had at one point also, we were working with one of the teams to try and have a map of all the collections. We're always thinking about how do we facilitate the transference of information? How do we make it easier for people to see it, to find it, to go? And so we thought that it would be interesting, for example, if I'm going to travel to Valencia, go and click on Valencia and see which collections we have that may be from Valencia, and start, doing a little bit of research. So it would be great to have a map like that also, that we could map all the collections in a way that if we go to Berlin, we click and we see all the collections, and or we could map the projects that are represented in the collections. Or so I think that those are really wonderful projects. They just are huge, right? What was the second question? Sorry.
Just about getting this
so
wonderful
jet-lagged.
information out to a broader audience, beyond the architecture community.
Yes, well, that is also very complex, and it is our main mission. How do we broadcast ourselves so that people know, not ourselves, but the archive, so that people know that it exists? And how do we entice researchers to come and write the history? So we put out all these initiatives, and we're constantly thinking about new ones and ways in which we can reach further. For a very long time, and maybe until 10, 15 years ago, it was within the modality that Milka had established, where it was networking, word of mouth. I knew somebody, I would tell you, you would tell her. But nowadays, everything moves at a much faster speed. There's a lot more information. And the window is closing. The window of opportunity is closing, especially for the women that are pre-digital, that once they disappear and their relatives don't know what to do with all the papers and they just, dispose of them, a lot of material is lost that way. And so how do we reach them? We don't know who they are, but how do we reach them so that they know that there's a place if they want to have the work preserved? There's a story that I always tell, it's a short story, that always fascinates me. There was a graduate from our school that was walking down in a town of Virginia, I don't remember the town. He was going out for a walk one afternoon and walks by a house that's being emptied, like somebody had passed away or they were going to renovate it, and there was a dumpster outside, and he sees these rolls of paper of drawings coming out, and being an architect, he kind of recognized them, and so he picked them up and took them and was looking at them and saw that they were, projects of a woman, and so he contacted the archive and sent the drawings, and it happened to be the first woman to get licensed in the state of Virginia. And so, it's always like, how many times I've told that story, and every time I tell it, I feel I get like goosebumps, because it's like, wow, it still amazes me, because it's so fragile. So much work gets lost that way. And so there's such an urgency, and we feel that the window of opportunity is closing, because those women, most have passed away or are at the age, 90 long. And so how do we reach them? It's still a challenge, and that's why I think that the only way is with an activist network. We need a broad network, a global network, to keep on pushing and asking and knocking on doors and calling, and we are 17 advisors to the board. We cannot, at the speed that things move, we just cannot figure out who they are and reach them all. It will only happen if we all do it. So it really, truly requires a network, and it really requires more branches of the archive or similar archives opening in other parts of the world.
Are you? Vale.
Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Lucia, and I speak tomorrow, and I'm going to present a project about a mapping work of women architects in Spain. So it really will be nice if you come tomorrow to see my keynote lecture, and maybe we can discuss about the difficulties of creating mappings about all this work. I think we can have a very nice conversation.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, this is one thing I want to say. just
Thank
to
you.
promote myself and my team. But I have a question regarding the archive. I think that all we are here, we know the archive for a long time, and the work it's doing is amazing. But through the years I was working in this topic, I have one question in my mind all the time that is related with queer studies. And somehow queer studies in architecture are also growing very fast. And the question of sexuality in the case of women architects is a key factor to understand the development of their career. So I was wondering if in the archive you are doing any kind of difference, or at least be able to know if in this group of women there are lesbian women working in a kind of different way or something like that. Because from my point of view, this is a turning point that is important to achieve or to tackle somehow. So I don't know if somehow, because intersectional approaches to architecture are stronger, and from my point of view, it's important to grow in this direction. So I was wondering if you share with me this thought, and how are you in the archive? I don't know, if you are somehow thinking about that in the archive, in the way you organize the information and so on.
I think that it is a question that comes up every now and then about that. And again, the way that it depends on what the person donating the material donates. So it goes back to the question that you were asking too. If they are willing to share that information, it will be present in the archive. If they don't, we would not necessarily know. The archive tries to, in itself, remain objective and, apolitical. And it's just simply, we are a box holding papers. You need to come and look at the papers and figure these things out. We'll do our best to preserve the papers for as long as possible, right? So I am sure that there are lesbian architects in the collections. It's not marked in any way, and it could be known only if they have chosen to share it in some form, right?
Okay, it's getting a bit late, so we are finishing the end of the day one. I'm so happy to have you here, Paola, working with the students and all of you. We will meet these days long. And today we are finishing with music. We have music because we had the money for drinks, so music. Tomorrow we will have catering all day long, but today we are with our pianist player. And if you want to have the latest program, because I've been changing even today, please download from the website, and you will be updated of all of we are going to do tomorrow. That we will begin at 9 o'clock, 9:30 with the research session, and then we will have communications, and then in the same hour than today, we will have Ana Socolina, Lucia Perez Moreno that was there in the main lecture, and we will welcome you. Hopefully tomorrow. There's very nice weather in Valencia. Sorry.
No, when you
I
finish.
had to say something that he told me that I had to say. Okay, then.
Yeah. I say it, okay. For those of you who have brought original work for the one-by-one call, we are preparing the exhibit that, as I mentioned earlier, will be set up tomorrow. And so most of you have sent the digital copies of what you were going to bring. We have worked with that material, but we would need the originals now. And so if you have not yet given us the original work, could you please give it to Carlos? Carlos will collect that material and will bring it to us so that tomorrow morning we can finish up the setting up of the exhibit.
I have Okay, of course. I have forgotten to say today all day long that the School of Architecture is promoting this event as the celebration of the Architecture Week, that is international celebration today and all the week. So this is the event that they propose to celebrate that, and for me it's an honor that we have women in architecture for celebrating the International Day of Architecture in Valencia. So let's take piano and see you tomorrow.